Well, hi, Aubrey. Thanks for joining me on the Comic Week podcast.
Hey, Charles. Thanks for having me, man. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm at home, but I'm thrilled to, be there with you in spirit.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. It's funny. I didn't realize this about you, but you actually are kind of from the RVA and the Henrico area specifically, which is where I'm sitting right now.
Yeah, man. I born and raised in Henrico, right outside of Richmond. My dad's from Short Pump, and my mom's from Varina. So I got East End and West End. We're getting very, very Richmond specific already on this podcast.
Oh no, absolutely. I mean, I'm in Short Pump myself, and I remember back in the day when Short Pump was just basically a hole in the wall. Now it's like the affluent part of the West End. So it's changed a lot in my lifetime.
I spent summers on my grandmother's farm out in Short Pump, and that's all it was, man. Cows everywhere, cows and fields.
So you tell me that we do our weekly new comic book day video with the gang at Alpha Comics, which is sort of the spiritual successor to Nostalgia Plus. But you actually used to work at that very mall, so you probably even know where we're shooting this from.
Dude, I can envision it now. Though I've seen pictures of Alpha, and it looks very different from what I remember. I worked at Old Navy. At the Willow Lawn Mall, and on my breaks, I would get a Chick-fil-A and or a Cinnabon, depending on how miserable I was feeling and how much stuff I wanted to shove in my face, and I would wander over to Nostalgia Plus and check out all the books.
Yeah, we would come up from south of Richmond, and my dad was like, I don't know, he had a thing about getting Midnight Marquee or Scarlet Street. He was into those 50s monsters. And so we would drive all over the damn place to get that stuff. So that's cool. So it's a long way from being in the RVA to being in comic books. But you took sort of a circuitous route. You got into you were an editor before you started being a creator. Although I guess editing is creating. And then you also worked in game development, or you were a community manager, I guess, for the WWE games. Is that correct?
Correct, yeah, man. And in between those two things, I worked at WWE.com. I did content writing and producing and stuff for the website.
So, how much of that colored your sort of your goal to write what is one of the more impressive graphic novels I've read in some time, which is the comic book history of professional wrestling? I mean, was that something that you were planning on doing when you were working with the WWE, or did that come later?
Absolutely not. First of all, thank you. I appreciate the compliment. I don't want to let that go unacknowledged. But no, man, writing comics was always the goal for me. That's why I started interning at Marvel, and that's why I got a job as an editor there, because I wanted to learn about comics. I wanted to learn how every aspect of these things get made, and I figured that being an editor would be the best way to do that. And I learned a ton, and it was great. And I moved on to WWE because it was an opportunity to go do another dream job, man. Comics and wrestling and video games. I've been really fortunate to work in, 3 dream fields, right? Not everybody gets an opportunity to do even one. But the comic book story of professional wrestling is a funny thing. My editor on that book, Patrick Barb, he's since gone freelance, but he was at 10 Speed Press. He was a fan of my wrestling podcast, Straight Shoot. And, we would cover contemporary wrestling, but also do retro stuff and, much different promotions and all. And he was a fan, and they were doing their line of the comic book story of blank books. And he had the bright idea to reach out to, the guy who does a wrestling podcast and is a comic book writer. And he reached out to me and asked me to do this thing. And my first thought was, oh man, that's going to be a ton of work. And it was, but my second thought was I would be furious if anybody else wrote this thing. This is a thing that I need to do. And so, I reached out to my buddy and my frequent collaborator, Chris Moreno, because, I knew coming into this thing that I was going to need a co-creator who could not only do characters extremely well, because there's hundreds of wrestlers in this thing, and they need to look like themselves, but not like in the the very like heavy photo referenced way that a lot of people do likenesses these days. I needed somebody who could handle that level of cartooning, which Chris is great at. And also since it's a full history going from like, you know, we start in earnest in the 1880s and go all the way up to the present. Because of that, I needed somebody who could do period stuff, right? And could draw things to look like the year in which they're actually taking place. And Chris is a genius at that stuff too. So, it was kind of a no-brainer to reach out to him because he's also, maybe not as big a wrestling fan as I am, but, he loves and appreciates wrestling and was a huge fan growing up too. So, yeah, man, it was a match made in heaven, and it was just kind of something that fell together. It wasn't a thing that I was out pitching or anything like that.
Well, what I found was really impressive about was the pacing. I mean, you get to the point where, yeah, I mean, it's chronological to a certain point, but then once you feel like, okay, I know where it's going now, you tie it to like, you know, sort of the present period, modern period of wrestling, the cable TV period, and then also at the same time, like from moment to moment, as you're sort of explaining the evolution of it, and I like the fact that from the outset, you're like, this was rigged from the probably rigged from the beginning, and this was like, I don't know, for a kid, you know, growing up when like, you know, during Hulkamania, finding out that wrestling is rigged is almost like finding out that there's no Santa Claus, and so it was kind of a devastating thing, and that became the thing that like, you know, the kids who just weren't, you know, into it would say, oh man, how can you watch that? That's fake and everything. But the fact is that like even in the sort of this one of the best tellings of the history of wrestling that I've ever read, that's like that's first and foremost like, yeah, dude, of course it was. Why wouldn't you think it is? And then it's really about the spectacle. And for me, I wasn't an early fan of wrestling as a sport or a spectacle. I grew up around it. Every time I got my hair cut, wrestling was on at the barber shop, you know. So I couldn't avoid it. I saw everybody. But it was seeing Darren Aronofsky's film The Wrestler with Mickey Rourke, where I really got a sense of like, you know, how much this form of entertainment seeped into the culture. You know, it was like him in his trailer looking at his Nintendo game, you know, with his licensed Nintendo game. And I thought about that great game, Pro Wrestling, and just how I played the hell out of it. And then it, Starman, all those guys, and it just made me think, you know, Hulk Hogan, Roddy Piper, you know, all of these guys were like, they were like there in your childhood. If you grew up in the 80s, you had MTV and you had wrestling.
Yeah, man. And you had wrestling on MTV too. It was a huge part of WWE's rise to prominence. Yeah, man. You know, I love hearing what you're telling me, just about, us kind of acknowledging wrestling's artifice right up front, because that was an intentional choice. You know, the name of this book is The Comic Book Story of Professional Wrestling. That's the name of the series, really. They did beer and video games and baseball. And I took that really seriously because, you know, I don't consider myself primarily a nonfiction, or I don't consider myself a nonfiction writer, really. You know, even though this book is this massive thing that I'm extremely proud of, it was kind of outside of my wheelhouse to write a nonfiction comic. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about what I like about nonfiction comics and what I don't like about them. And the thing that really sticks in my craw, and I'm not going to name any names, so don't ask. Don't you dare ask me, Charles. But the thing that sticks in my craw about a lot of nonfiction comics is that they read more like anecdote than a story. And what I mean by that is that, you know, an anecdote is a thing that happened. It's true, right? But there's no narrative to it. There's no artistry to the telling of an anecdote. It's just a list of things that happened. And I think that that's a trap that comic book nonfiction comics fall into really frequently, because the fact of the matter is, it's hard. It's hard writing a comic. It's hard writing nonfiction. And it's doubly hard doing both because there's so many restrictions, right? If you're doing a nonfiction prose thing, you can hop around and you can take a moment and explain things in a way that you can't really with comics because things need to stay so visual. And so, it was a difficult thing to write and to pace out. And in order to do it, we started with what I refer to as thesis statements, right? Just these larger general ideas that because because we had this huge list of things we need to cover, like worldwide, right? Because there's chapters on Japan and Mexico and the United Kingdom. Because of that, we weren't going to be able to do a natural through line, right? Like it's not like doing a biography of someone where you just follow them from birth until death. We were going to have to hop around a lot. And so for that connective tissue, we really needed to find these thesis statements. And one of them, you touched on immediately because we talk about really early in the book is this idea that wrestling has always been wrestling, right? There is this tendency within wrestling fandom to talk about like when kayfabe died, which is kayfabe is like the artifice of wrestling, right? For people who aren't wrestling fans. When people started realizing that wrestling wasn't fake or started thinking or wasn't legitimate or that it was fixed or that it wasn't on the up and up. And the fact of the matter is, as long as there's been wrestling, right, going back to the carnival days in the 1880s, as long as there's been professional wrestling, it's been fixed. It's been rigged. And that's actually part of this form of entertainment, as well as the constantly shifting scale of saying, oh, well, this isn't real, but it used to be, right? Which people are constantly doing. People look back at the 80s and talk about how, the 80s, that's when wrestling was real, and no, it wasn't. it was fixed in a bunch of nonsense. And like maybe they did the moves differently, or maybe the guys looked differently, but it was rigged back then too. It's been rigged for over 100 years now. So no, I love that you picked up on that because we put a lot of work into finding these larger thesis statements that could act as through lines throughout the book.
Well, I think people would probably be horrified to see the actual logical manifestation of the type of violent, over-the-top violence you would see in a wrestling match. I mean, wrestling is as artificial as it is. It's a very intricate, choreographed stage performance. It's also very dangerous, and there have been wrestlers who've been paralyzed and killed practicing something that in public display that they've practiced in training rooms, and if you're at the WWE level, you have to be at the top tier of your profession. So it's not like they're just letting anybody jump off the top rope on somebody. So I would imagine that if it wasn't artificial, it would be a much more horrifying sport to behold.
Maybe, man, or much more boring. Probably both, honestly. Because that's another thing that we talk about in the book too. Is that we call wrestling the one true sport. It's on the cover, and we use it throughout the book liberally. I've heard from some people maybe a little too much, but because we wanted to drive it home for folks that this is what makes wrestling so great, is that unlike football or baseball or basketball or hockey, or I'm just listing sports at you, but unlike a legitimate sport, which might give you moments of like transcendent drama and passion and drama, right? Wrestling always does, because wrestling is, when it's done well, wrestling is designed to do that. It doesn't happen by accident like it does in a legitimate sport. It's designed from the ground up to get a rise out of you, and that's another one of the kind of thesis statements of the book, is that wrestling exists for one purpose, which is to get a rise out of you and make sure you're back in the same spot next week, and that's it. And there's something very crass, but also something wrestling is all about deception, and it's all about fooling you, but there's also kind of a really refreshing honesty to how crass of a form of entertainment it is, I think.
Well, if you think about it, again, going back to the sort of the more flamboyant wrestling outfits, I mean, wrestlers in the 1980s were basically bulked up David Lee Roths running around there, with the spandex clothes and the very flamboyant outfits. They basically were real life superheroes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's like it's a really common comparison point. Like when I left Marvel to go work at WWE, I heard that from a lot of people that like, wrestlers are superheroes, and they're like real life superheroes. And WWE even uses that sometimes, and sometimes more than others, right? They change their language all the time, but I think it's an interesting observation. I think that there's actually a lot more there are a lot deeper similarities between wrestling and American superhero comics as well. And I think that, aside from the window dressing, right? Like the fact that like John Cena looks like an Ed McGuinness drawing, right? Like aside from that kind of stuff, I think for me, the real common thread between the two is that they're serialized entertainment, right? And they're serialized, and beyond that, they're serialized entertainment that grew out of a place where they were considered disposable, where it was considered low class and, ephemeral, right? Nobody ever intended for people to go back and read Spider-Man, right? Like early on, like that wasn't in the cards. That wasn't something that anybody was thinking about, right? Similarly, nobody expected for there to be a WWE network where you can go back and watch old episodes of Raw from like 1995 or whatever, right? I think that is actually a fascinating similarity between the two that has wide-ranging ramifications for how these mediums have evolved. And it's interesting comparing the two genres, right? Like WWE wrestling and American superhero comics, because American superhero comics, as anybody listening to this podcast knows, have started moving towards a format and have by this point fully moved towards a publishing schema in which there's permanence, right? These aren't considered ephemeral anymore, right? These are parts of concrete, like discrete storylines that get collected into trades and hardcovers and omnibuses and stuff like that are meant to sit on your shelf and be revisited, right? Just like books, right? Like, and that's something relatively new. Wrestling hasn't gotten to that place yet. Wrestling has spent more of its history sticking solely to this ephemeral, disposable, serialized form of entertainment. And I think it's interesting too that wrestling has remained much more mainstream than American superhero comics have as a result of that, because it's something you can hop into. I don't know. I think that there are a wealth of comparisons and contrasts to make between American superhero comics and wrestling, to be sure, man.
Well, if you think about it, your big summer event from Marvel or DC, I mean, there's your WrestleMania, right? It's multiple books. It's more than the $4 per issue every week.
Everybody
every 2 weeks
shows
or
up
every
on the
month.
card. Everybody has a match.
Right. You have the kayfabe still there in superhero comics. Does anybody actually really think that the Immortal Hulk is going to get killed, or that something really terrible is going to befall Spider-Man? I mean, with rare exceptions, only the most talented writers ever get a chance to really push the envelope. Like the companies value these properties that they're not going to let just anybody, some steward of the series make some everlasting change to the Invisible Woman. I mean, you have to be Frank Miller level to do anything really incontrovertible. And then also you have the other thing is that you have the heel turn for some superhero characters, and then you have villains having their good turn where they become Venom becomes a good guy for a while, Catwoman becomes a good guy for a while. So if you have a comic book character that is a villain that's super popular, they will find a way to give you more of that and make them worth rooting for.
Yeah, man, absolutely. It's interesting. I think that there are, there's another similarity between American superhero comics and the reason I say that every time, American superhero comics, right? Because I don't want to imply that those are the only types of comics, right? Comics is this big, broad, beautiful thing. But speaking specifically about American superhero comics and comparing it to like WWE style wrestling, I think another point of similarity is that in both of these things, you are essentially stuck in a never-ending act two, right? You can't ever really, as you mentioned, you can't really ever affect real lasting change because the story engines you can't break the story engine because there needs to be another one of these things next week. And it's sort of it's sort of a real sleight of hand to be able to keep people invested while also kind of winking at the fact that nothing's really going to change and this thing is just going to keep on churning ahead. And I think that in wrestling that manifests itself, in the thing that people say all the time, which is that it's not like the outcome, the finish of a match isn't important, right? Like whether somebody wins or loses, it doesn't really matter, right? Like there are some promotions that care about win-loss records, but they usually give it up after a while, because it's not as interesting as this other option, which is to place importance on how somebody wins or loses. And I think that superhero comics are very similar in that regard, and maybe even a little bit more limited because, you know, you need the hero has to win, right? And that's true in wrestling too, right? On a long left timeline, the hero has to win. What the question is, and how you make this thing interesting is figuring out how to delay that gratification of the hero winning, and then also finding a way for them to win that actually communicates something about themselves and the villain they're facing, right? And that's true of either comics or wrestling. And I think that that's kind of the big difference between good wrestling and bad wrestling, right? Bad wrestling is just perfunctory and people win matches or lose matches and there's no narrative there and it doesn't communicate anything about the characters. And bad superhero comics are kind of the same way, right? Bad superhero comics have fights where it's just people taking turns punching each other over and over again until one of them punches hardest or one of them wins the punch fest. And that is, you know, that can scratch an itch to be sure, but it's not as fulfilling and it's certainly not as transcendent as these genre mediums can be when done properly, I think.
So did you get any feedback from any wrestlers that you knew? What was the community, the actual the wrestling industry reaction to the book?
Really strong, man. So like back when I did my wrestling podcast, I would have a lot of wrestlers on the show. And I leaned on them really in a very real way. When I was working on this thing, I would text them questions and send them early drafts and stuff. Excalibur, who is the liaison to the board of directors at PWG, Pro Wrestling Guerrilla, and he's also one of the voices of AEW currently. He's a pal of mine, and he read early drafts of the script before things were even drawn, and sent me a few notes. Actually more than a few on, you know, some things that I'd gotten like a little bit mixed up on, especially in the Japanese wrestling chapter, because he's much more well versed in that stuff than I am. As well as just some kind of like how I was phrasing things and like kind of the emphasis I was putting on stuff. Similarly, I got feedback from Shayna Baszler and Roderick Strong, Tommaso Ciampa, Adam Cole, all these people who used to be my podcast and now are part of the big WWE machine. It's been great, man. Chris Hero as well, was super supportive and, talked up the book a lot, online and I continue to hear from people that like Chris Hero told them about the book, which is a really cool feeling to have, man.
Well, I hope more people in that community like it. I mean, I really do think it was like a love letter to that profession, and you know, anybody who had their story depicted in the book, you know, was treated with class and shown to be the.
That was one of the big goals. Is I wanted to do something that was accurate but also respectful. You know, because the fact of the matter is, I do know a lot of wrestlers, and I've been fortunate enough to make friends with a lot of wrestlers through Straight Shoot and just the internet, 2019, and stuff like that. And writing this thing, I always had the back of my head, would this be something that I would be ashamed to show my wrestler pals, right? If the answer was even maybe, I rewrote it. I changed it. Not to hide things, because I don't think we shy away from like the dark, ugly stuff in wrestling, right? And in wrestling's past. But because I wanted to, above all else, be respectful, because there's so many histories of wrestling and so many books about wrestling that, you know, they go in one of two directions. They take the tact of like, look at this awful, disgusting, violent blood sport for morons tact, right? Like that's one way. And it's not even real. It's a disgusting blood sport and it's not even real, right? Like that's one tact.
Right.
And obviously I didn't want to do that. But then the other way is this kind of, in wrestling fandom, it's called smart marks, right? There are people who are marks, which is to say they're fans of wrestling, but they believe themselves to be smart, and they're smartened up, and they understand how it works, and they love talking about backstage stuff and who hates who and rumors and star ratings and stuff like that. And that's all fine and good, but it's not, it's no more real than, you know, like believing that everything you see on TV is correct, right? Because that's also something that wrestling industry has learned how to work and how to use in order to kind of churn up this fandom and get them all worked up and into what they're watching. And so I also wanted to avoid going down that route. I didn't want to do something that made me seem like somebody who thinks they know and understand a lot more than they actually do. So I was really careful to only talk about things that actually happened, that we know happened, right? So it was never a thing of like, oh, well, you know, this guy hated this guy backstage and there was this incident with this woman and they had this backstory. Like, it's none of that stuff, man, because that's not verifiable. And when I do have to get into that stuff, I was really careful about using, I don't know, and on Wikipedia, they call them weasel words, right? So there are things like,
right.
Well, it's dead, or, you know, or people say,
right.
like, so it's not like, you're not actually making a statement. And so I use those when I had to, but, yeah, man, it was important to me that I be able to hand this to my wrestler friends. And so the fact that so many of them dug it and so many of them gave us like pull quotes for the back, Cody Rhodes, Roderick Strong, Victor from the Ascensions, another pal of mine. The fact that they all dig it, I feel like that, like as great as it is having wrestling fans tell me how good it is and how much they like it, or like, you know, something else that's really cool is people who aren't wrestling fans who pick it up and read it because they're comic book fans or they like nonfiction stuff or they want to understand what it is people like about wrestling. When those people love it, I'm over the moon, but it still doesn't compare to actual wrestlers who I respect and put in the book even, telling me how much they love it, man.
Well, I think every time I saw the Nature Boy Ric Flair in your book, I smiled. You know, I think you guys pretty much on every panel he ever shows up, it's totally him.
And he's in a bunch of them, man. You must have been grinning ear to ear during that read.
Yeah, so let's move ahead. I mean, to what you're doing now. I mean, of course, we have 3 issues of No One Left to Fight, which is being published by Dark Horse. In fact, actually, I went out in the market, and this week we'll give away to one of our readers a CGC 9/8 copy of No One Left to Fight #1 on our contest page.
The first printing or the second?
First printing, yeah.
Wow, those are hard to come by, man. That is a nice. I don't even have any of those left. I sold them all. Cover price, of course, but I got rid of all. I don't even have any of them. That's awesome.
No, and then of course, I guess the first issue did go to a second print, like you said. We actually, I think when we featured it a few weeks ago, I think when issue 2 came out, I must have mistakenly grabbed the second printing in the video. But no, I've really enjoyed the story. I think it's really, I call it basically a sort of a superheroes once they grow older. In a world that looks like it was colored like in the same palette as a bowl of Trix cereal. It's really just it's a really beautiful book. I think the world building, you know, this is obviously a 5-issue miniseries. I don't know if you had planned to take it beyond that if it became popular, but just the level of world building that is apparent even in the first panels. When Vale is going to visit his friends, you know, just the world that it's in, I want to see more of it. There's so many, it's so difficult, I think, to put the reader into a completely alien environment and do it in such a way where it actually looks authentic. And I think you guys did just a fantastic job with this. And the story itself, I mean, it's sort of a misnomer saying there's no one left to fight, because obviously as the story develops, you'll find out that's not true. But there was conflict from the beginning with Vale and Timor. So I wanted to ask you a little bit what your inspiration for it. Were you influenced by maybe Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns, where he painted a older Batman going back to wearing the cape, or did you have other influences?
It's interesting. A fun thing about doing No One Left to Fight, which all of it's fun, honestly. Working with Fico, who's like a dear friend of mine, and we've been wanting to work together for years, and he is doing the work of his career right now on No One Left to Fight. He's coloring himself for the first time, and it's like folks just heard. It's the first thing anybody mentions or notices about the book is I tell people it looks like a Lisa Frank folder, right? It's like Lisa Frank aesthetic, and I love it. But it's been fascinating hearing everybody's take on what the influences are and where we're pulling from, right? One of the first things that people said to me that kind of took me aback was a Street Fighter connection, right? People are like, oh yeah, it's like Street Fighter. It's like a Street Fighter book. And I like Street Fighter and all, but like that wasn't really the intent. But if people want to pick it up from it, great, man. Similarly, I've heard, Goku, I've heard, like Vale, Timor, Krista, I've heard that compared to Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, right? And I read a review where somebody went like really in detail on that, and I was like, oh, that's really interesting, because that wasn't really the plan either. This book's, and so it's fascinating hearing you talk about, Dark Knight Returns, which of course I've read and I love. It is a foundational piece of American comics, right? And you cannot escape its influence, right? For better or for worse. It's fascinating to hear you say that, because that was never really the intent, as people might have guessed, because I actually accidentally said Goku a second ago. The book started from me and Fico just wanting to do Dragon Ball, right? Like, we love Dragon Ball, and that's the thing we bonded over at San Diego Comic-Con one year, and we wanted to do something that made us feel like Dragon Ball made us feel when we first started watching it. And that's, and we both started with Dragon Ball Z, which is, if people are familiar, Dragon Ball Z was the follow-up to Dragon Ball, and Dragon Ball was all those characters as kids, and then Dragon Ball Z starts up, and the main character who you watch grow up over the course of Dragon Ball, Goku, he's got a wife and a kid, and he's still got all these old friends, and they've had all these adventures together, and, people show up, and it's never really explained super in-depth who they are or how they know each other or what they did, but they clearly have this really rich backstory and history with one another, and so that was the primary inspiration, man. That was really where we started. And again, it's interesting you bring up the Dark Knight Returns thing, because while there is kind of this surface similarity in terms of like it's a hero who has done all these things, and now what? Now what happens to him? I think that there's for me the big difference is that the answer, like Dark Knight Returns is a story about getting back into the saddle, right? It's a story about the old gun. It's not, it's a story that's been done a bunch of times, not because Frank Miller, this isn't a knock on Frank Miller, who's amazing, obviously, but this is a trope, right? This is a commonly used story. It's the old gunslinger coming back for one last caper or whatever it is, right? It's a thing that happens all the time. And ours is a little bit different, because what our story is about is after you've accomplished what you wanted to accomplish, after you've become the best, after you've saved the world, after you've done everything that you had been striving for and you had dedicated your life to doing, well, then what? And so like while Dark Knight Returns is very much like a mid or a late life crisis, right, book, I think that No One Left to Fight is a little bit younger than that. Like I envision Vale and Timor in their 30s, right? This is a book about, like up through your 20s, you've got a wealth of possibilities looking at you and options, and you can change careers, and you can do different things. You can just up and move, and it doesn't really matter because you're not really locked into anything yet. But by the time you hit your 30s, in your mid 30s especially, you start feeling the restrictions of not just age, but of the choices that you've already made and what that has both afforded you and won you, but also what it's cost you. And, in terms of opportunity costs, that, you can't do, like, I'm never going to, Charles, I love you with you. I'm never going to become an astronaut. It's just not in the cards, right? At this point in my life.
Right.
And that's kind of what No One Left to Fight is about. It's about realizing that maybe your best days are past you, but your life's not over, and you need to figure out what is next for you and what you're going to fucking do with yourself, man.
Well, Vale also, I think, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I didn't create it, you did. But it seems to me that, the cost of the personal costs that he bore, not just, loved ones or whatever. I mean, he doesn't seem like he's all that close to very many people. And sometimes I think it's by design. But he also seems like the saving the world had a very big toll on him. He's certainly afflicted with something. He may seem like he might have PTSD or something like that, but obviously, no matter what he tries to do, Timur sees him as a natural rival for Krista's feelings. Winda, another character that we learn more about in the third issue, not to spoil it for anybody, but she clearly is over the moon for him, but he just doesn't seem like he has whatever that thing is, that easygoing, live in his life, take things as they come kind of personality, or maybe just the weight of what he's done has made him alien to just normal life. And so I'm excited to see where it goes in the next two issues, because really the story could be about anything from this point.
It's exciting to hear. It's exciting to hear you say that, and I hope you don't think that I'm being evasive or closed off or anything. But I've done whenever I do interviews for No One Left to Fight, kind of a similar thing happens. Is I start getting questions or kind of lines of conversation that are that I don't want to say spoilers, but just like what I was talking about before about Dragon Ball Z, right? For me, a big appeal of Dragon Ball Z was watching this thing and somebody would show up and they wouldn't, like Tien and Yamcha would, or Tien and Chaozu would show up, and I would think, who are these weird? What is this? This guy has 3 eyes. This guy is dressed like a little clown. He's got this weird high voice. What is this all about? And it never explained it. And it forced me to kind of build up that backstory in my head and try and piece it together and try and figure it out. And it ultimately made that stuff all that much more rewarding because I had to sit with it and ruminate on it. And in a day and age when you can just hop on Wikipedia and find answers to anything, or go on social media and ask somebody and have like a dozen people crawl up into your mentions and actually you about canon and lore, that is a experience that people don't really get that often anymore. And so we wanted to recreate that. We wanted to give this sense of mystery and the unexplained and this feeling that there is this broader, wider world, but we're not going to tell you all about it right yet. We're going to tell you about it when we need to and when you need to know. And everything else you should piece together on your own. And people are doing a really good job. I love chit-chat with folks about it and hearing what they think is going on or what things mean or what really is happening and stuff like that. And it's all fascinating. And that part of the story, honestly, the time you spend, just this is a Scott McCloud thing, but the most important part of a comic book isn't an individual panel. It's not the action. It's not the art. It's not the words. It's not any of that stuff. It's the gutters, right? It's space in between the panels because that's where the human brain does all the heavy lifting, right? To get you from panel to panel. And No One Left to Fight takes that approach writ large, right? Because we're doing it with the story as well. There's a lot we leave unsaid and there's a lot we don't tell people because we want you to fill in the blanks because it's going to make what's coming that much more rewarding. That's the kind of guiding philosophy of No One Left to Fight.
Yeah, well, like I said, you and Fico have done just a fantastic job with that, and not only from the actual not only the execution of the product itself, but the hype the hype machine that you guys put into place. I mean, I love it. I love seeing the comic you always wanted. I love the solicits, the way they're written. I love, here's a line, most berserk issue length brawl you've ever seen committed to the comics page. I find that when I look at like that type of copy that's written to try to get people to buy comic book shops, essentially, to stock product, I find that this industry has a golden age of content being created right now. The reins have been let off because comic book publishers understand that they're not going to be selling 8 or 10 million copies of comics anymore, that they're going to have to work the margins, so they have to sharpen their pencil, and that they need to be more creative with what they put out. And so we're getting better content than we probably have ever had. And no matter what you're interested in, whether it's a superhero comic, an adult story, a crime comic, barbarians fighting each other with swords and cleaving each other's limbs off, you get just an amazing array of comics on any given week. And I am just, it just staggers me that the way the industry has marketed this material is that the amount of excitement that should be felt for ongoing series, for any of this, it really just centers around #1 issues, and after that, like it's the B team. And I see that the way you've dealt with No One Left to Fight and the solicits on the cover itself. I mean, it just tells you, buy this comic, you're gonna have fun with it. And it's not something I necessarily see writ large across the entire industry. And it's a shame, really.
Yeah, it's a thank you, first of all. That's really great to hear that the stuff is working. But truthfully, it's real easy because for me at least, I can't speak for anybody else, but the fact of the matter is, Fico and I are, and Taylor and Brett and everybody at Dark Horse, we are wildly excited about this book. We're incredibly proud of it. We're super excited about it. It is Fico and my first, I think it's Fico's first like creator-owned work, and it's my first creator-owned fiction work, right? Because the comic book story is professional wrestling, that's creator-owned as well, but that was a graphic novel thing for the book market, so it's different too. But this is a big deal for us, man, and we're really excited about it. And we call it the comic you always wanted because really, I mean, and I say this honestly, it's the comic we always wanted, and that's how we designed this thing. We designed it, it is everything we love about fight manga, right? Whether it's Dragon Ball is the biggest inspiration, obviously, but there's some One Punch Man in there. There's for sure some JoJo's Bizarre Adventure in there. There's some Fist of the North Star and some Berserk, and that's getting into like seinen manga, right? But it's fight manga, but it's fight manga remixed and put into a format that is more palatable to American comic book readers, right? And we really did try to layer in everything that we love about comics and squeeze it into these 5 issues. And so it's easy to be excited about it, man. And, my thinking on things always has been that there is this tendency from creators sometimes to play the tortured artist, right? To do the, I made a thing, check this out if you want to. I'll tell you what, brother, that doesn't get me interested to check something out. Right?
Right.
If the person who made something isn't excited about it, I sure am not going to be excited about it. And so we take the other route, man. We let people know. We are shameless about it, but we're also incredibly honest about it. This is a book we love, we're extraordinarily proud of, and we want everyone to pick it up and read it, because I think that it's got something for just about everybody inside of those pages, and we want to share that with the world, man. And I think that it's kind of, what I always tell people is, you should be excited about and proud of everything you create. And if you're not, then you should have worked harder on it. Like you should have done a better job, right? If it's not the best thing, if it's the best thing you can do, you should be proud of it and excited about it. And if it's not, then you should go back to the lab. You should get to work, and you should get your reps in, and you should make it better. And that's very much the way Fico and Taylor and Brett and I feel about No One Left to Fight, man. and we're thrilled to share it with people.
Do you see the possibility that there will be more stories to tell in this world with these characters after this miniseries wraps up?
Yeah, Fico and I spent months and months of before we even started pitching this thing. Before I had written anything, before we'd drawn anything, we spent months and months of back and forth emails fleshing out this world. And again, it all started from a place of like, well, what do we like about Dragon Ball, and how do we take that and how do we do our own thing with it? And how do we improve upon that? And how do we refine it? And how do we add these more characters in? And what's this other stuff we want to mention? And man, before we even started pitching, we had ideas for subsequent series. Not just, what comes next, but prequels. And, there's so many characters. There's a ton of characters. We put out, Fico did a big, spread that's like, the title card at the beginning of Dragon Ball episodes, right, of the entire cast. And there's characters in that thing that you have not even seen yet. They have not shown up. Because that's just the breadth of this world. And we would love to. We've got stories to go years, man. I am not exaggerating. Fico comes up for San Diego Comic-Con every year, and we've spent every breakfast this year sitting, chit-chatting, and me taking notes about subsequent No One Left to Fight series and spin-offs and one-shots and all that good stuff. So if people keep buying them, we'll keep making them, man. That's our promise.
Well, yeah, well, people definitely should keep buying them. And, it's like I said, this is, I don't know how many comics I've read that are in this sort of this futuristic sci-fi kind of world that, the world building is just totally lackluster. But the world in this book must have been a real bitch to draw, because it is so detailed, so rich and layered, and so well crafted that it really stood out the second I opened the book up, and that's there's a lot of really nice comics out these days. It's not. You're not guaranteed that reaction, when you see something. So I was really impressed. So anyway, I just want to let you know that on a personal level, I've loved it. So one of the things that I've been thinking about lately, and I think we've been trying to, as we're crafting out what we want to do with Comic Week, we have a really popular coin website, and we just really kind of said, well, let's focus our energy on some of these Gen X hobbies that we grew up with that we never grew out of. And one of the things that, I think when you start looking at creative stuff, I start thinking about an auteur theory, who are the authors who are really the ones responsible for the product, and the reason why you like it wouldn't have been there without their input. Do you think that comics sort of follows the same sort of way that movies operate, where there's basically an author or a team of authors without whom the story couldn't be told in the way that resonates with people?
I think that there are cases where that's true, right? And I think it's far from. I think it's rare, though, honestly. At least in terms of American mainstream comics, right? If you're looking at American indie comics or art comics, of course, right? Charles Burns, right? Charles Burns isn't just an auteur; he's an iconoclast, right? And he does what he does, and he does it regardless of what anybody else thinks. And the works he creates are solely him. They are uniquely, powerfully him, right? I think that the bulk of American comics, however, don't really subscribe to that. And there are outliers within American comics. You mentioned Frank Miller earlier. Frank Miller is obviously an auteur, right? He is a guy who, you can't imagine Dark Knight Returns and Dark Knight Strikes Again working if someone else was drawing it, right? I can, at least. I mean, maybe you have a better imagination than I do. But I think that most American comics, most American mainstream comics, right, and direct market stuff, right, so superheroes and genre work No One Left to Fight, it comes from a different history, right? It doesn't come from a history of one cartoonist sitting down and making this piece of artwork. It comes from a history that is all about an assembly line, right? Whether it was kind of, Marvel and DC editorial farming these things out and then bullpen and things like that, or whether it's a guy like Will Eisner running a studio. I don't know. I think that once you get into that type of production, it's much harder for me to be okay with pointing at one name as being kind of like the primary creative force, which I think is kind of what auteur theory implies, right? And there's, I look at my bookshelf right now. I'm like, so like I'm looking at like Jack Kirby's Fourth World stuff. There are other people who worked on those. Like he had a gaggle of different inkers on those books, but they were still written and drawn by Kirby. So, and likewise with movies, there's other people involved with these things, but I think with American comics, the way they're typically made, where you've got a writer, you've got an artist, you've got a letterer, you've got a colorist, maybe you've got some inkers, I don't think that really fits into an auteur theory schema, personally.
Well, I'll just give a couple examples that I feel like. Last week, Spider-Man Going Big, like was a one-shot Marvel put out, had the return of Eric Larson on Spider-Man, which is something that I never thought I'd see again, and I couldn't believe just how much I missed it. When I saw it, and of course, with Savage Dragon, I don't know anybody who would do Savage Dragon the way Eric Larson would do it, and I think despite the fact that the series is now up to 245 issues, that the last 50 issues are probably among the best in the series' entire run. Peter Bagg did a one-shot for Marvel, the Megalomaniacal Spider-Man, which is also one of the great Spider-Man sort of novelty stories. And so when I look at those guys, I'm like, well, there's maybe something to it. The Pearl, Brian Michael Bendis, his recent collaboration for Jinx World, I think was really utterly amazing. And it just seemed like, it wasn't even so much that it was sort of an outshoot of maybe like, ideas that they put together with Jessica Jones. It seemed like its own thing. I couldn't imagine anyone else doing it. Or Lemire and Ormond on Black Hammer. There's just something to some of these teams when they're working together.
If Lemire and Ormstead are, if Black Hammer is like an auteur project, who's the auteur? Because I couldn't.
Well, I would. Yeah, so I guess what I would say about that is I would say that unlike with film, maybe you have Hitchcock, or maybe you'd have Truffaut or somebody like that. Maybe it is like certain teams, and maybe this only comes across when you have creator controlled content more often than not. But when you have a team of one or two people that work together consistently and they have a vision, maybe that's sort of where I'm going with it. I think maybe limiting it to just one person might not be enough. But I do think that some of these teams, when they team up, there's just a magic to it. Like they understand each other's pacing and moves, and like somebody drawing Bendis panels when you have all that vertical text bubbles. I mean, that does take a certain level of craft to make that not boring.
I'll say this, man. I think that I think you are onto something, and when I work with guys like Chris Moreno on Complicated Professional Wrestling or Fico Alcio on No One Left to Fight, it elevates me. It makes me a better writer because I know what those guys bring to the table, and I strive to pitch them softballs right over the plate so they can knock it out of the park, man. That really is my primary goal, and I try and find ways to play to their strengths and give them the opportunity to do the things that they excel at. And I think that a thing that comics as a medium and an industry has over every other visual medium is how few people actually need to be involved, right? You can sit down and you can make a comic by yourself tonight if you want to, right? You can do the mini comic fold and staple thing, and you've made a comic. It's right there. But even if we're talking about big Marvel and DC releases, right, where there's a bunch of people involved, really, who is it? It's a penciler. I mean, it's a writer, it's a penciler, it's an inker maybe, and a lot of people are kind of doing both these days. It's a colorist, it's a letterer. It's 5 people. Maybe there's an editor involved. nothing compared to a film or a TV show, right? To get more control, you'd have to go write a novel, which is obviously isn't a visual medium. And, I think that this is one of the real forgotten strengths of comics. Because, it used to be that what everybody said about comics was, oh, well, what comics does that movies and television cannot is they have a unlimited special effects budget. And so you can have Namor and all the sea monsters attacking New York City in a way that you could never commit to film. But we have CG now. And so that's not really a thing that comics have over other visual mediums anymore. And then it became serialization, right? If you wanted the hit of just monthly churning in and out, like every single month, storytelling, you had to go to comics. You had to get it there. But now we have the Marvel movies. You have the Marvel TV shows. You have the DC universe. That itch can get scratched elsewhere. I think that it's incumbent upon comic book creators to figure out what is unique about their medium and what can their medium do that others cannot. And for my money, one of the most important things and the best things is control, is the fact that No One Left to Fight really is, like, anything you see on the page, it's me and Fico and Taylor. Period. That's it. Like there's not a room full of cats that we have to herd in order to get this thing made. And maybe that's not auteur theory exactly, but I think it's something similar, right? It's the strength that comes with that creative control that you were talking about.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. And you don't have like a $10 million property that you can't do something to because like the legal wants to make sure that they sell t-shirts and toys. So what are you reading right now?
Right now I am reading two books. They're both prose right now. I'm reading Hyperion by Dan Simmons, which is this very cool sci-fi book, which I was always a fantasy kid growing up. I never got super into sci-fi, and I've been veering more into sci-fi, and it happened because I read some Jack Vance, and then I read some Gene Wolfe, and that it's kind of weird, like space fantasy stuff. And so I'm reading Hyperion by Dan Simmons, and I'm also reading this nonfiction book about John Brown. Called John Brown, the Abolitionist. It's by David S. Reynolds. And on deck for when I finish one of these, because I like to have two books going at the same time so I can hop back and forth. Next up, whenever I finish whichever one of these I finish first, I've got the big, my editor, Brett Israel at Dark Horse, sent me the big volume 2 hardcover of Berserk that I'm dying to tear into. So that'll be next.
No, that would be excellent. And you think you might ever get back to the podcast thing? Maybe do another episode of Scald, or is that wrapped up?
That's done for now, man. I did Scald for 2 or 3 years, and I did like 161 episodes or something, and it was a grind, man. And I learned a lot. I think I came out of it so for people who aren't familiar, Scald was my weekly serialized storytelling podcast. It wasn't a podcast about storytelling. It was a podcast where I told a story. And it was an ongoing serialized thing. It was a weird, sort of like psychedelic, trippy, barbarian thing. With a lot of like magic and weird gods and strange stuff going on. And, it wasn't an audio play. Like it wasn't a radio serial. I didn't do wacky voices or sound effects. It was just me. I would write a story ahead of time and then I would read it in one take. And that was the gimmick. Is that I did every episode in one take. And, man, I learned a ton. And a lot of what I learned is on display in No One Left to Fight in terms of doing serialized storytelling and weaving multiple threads and, keeping a lot of balls in the air and plates spinning and mixing my metaphors. But I don't know. I've always kept the door open that I could come back and do some more if I wanted to, but right now I'm having so much fun doing No One Left to Fight, and I've got a new thing that it's not ready to be announced yet, but I've got a new thing that Dark Horse picked up that'll be coming out soon, hopefully. Man, I'm getting my creative itches scratched elsewhere.
All right. Well, maybe one day, if there's any luck, we'll get a Scald comic, and that'd be dope.
Maybe.
All right, Aubrey, I appreciate very much you stopping by and chatting with us. It's been really cool to talk to you, and good job on your two latest projects. Really good stuff.
Thanks, man. I really appreciate it. Charles, thank you so much for inviting me on the show.
All right, cool. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.